Welcome to History in Ashes, where we walk together through the remnants of humanity's past, not just the grand victories or the loud proclamations of power, but also the ashes, the details, often overlooked, that still shape the world you live in today. You and I are about to step into one of the darkest and most unsettling chapters of human history. The nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the final days of the Second World War. Before we even begin the journey, let me share with you a few truths that may unsettle your sleep tonight. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in early August of 1945, the light it produced was brighter than the sun, so searing that the shadows of people were burned into stone walls. Within seconds, tens of thousands of men, women, and children ceased to exist. Some left only outlines, imprinted forever on bridges, pavements, and stairways. Survivors described skin hanging from their arms like melting wax, while others wandered the city silently, their bodies scorched, their eyes blinded, holding on to what little remained of their lives. In Nagasaki, only 3 days later, the destruction was so immense that cathedral bells melted into puddles of bronze, while entire neighborhoods were erased in the span of a heartbeat. Think about this. 2 cities, bustling with ordinary lives just hours before, were transformed into wastelands where silence screamed louder than any bomb could. Now, here's where you come in. Since you and I are about to travel deep into this story together, I want to pause and ask you a favor. Could you, right now, scroll down to the comments and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are? It feels strangely fitting, because in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, time itself was split into a before and an after. I would love to see from which corner of the world you are joining me on this path through history. And while you're there, go ahead and subscribe to History in Ashes. Think of it this way. Subscribing here is a lot less destructive than pushing a red button, but it still unleashes a chain reaction this time. One of curiosity, knowledge, and shared history. Unlike an atomic bomb, this chain reaction is safe to spread. Let's step back for a moment. It is tempting to think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki only as tragedies that happened in August of 1945, isolated in their horror. But history never unfolds in isolation. These bombings were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were the result of decades of technological ambition, scientific obsession, global conflict, and the smallest decisions of men who believed they were shaping the future. And in many ways, they did. Yet, what fascinates me, and perhaps will fascinate you too, are not just the massive geopolitical shifts, but the small details. The children who never made it to school that morning, the farmer who saw a blinding flash while tending to his crops, the office worker who survived because he had stopped to tie his shoelace. These tiny moments, forgotten in the grand sweep of history, are the ones that tell us the most about resilience and fragility. But before we move too quickly, picture Hiroshima in the summer of 1945. It was not a military base, not a battlefield lined with tanks and trenches, but a living, breathing city. Streets were filled with bicycles. Small markets bustled with food vendors. Women hung laundry on clotheslines, and children ran across narrow lanes. There were soldiers stationed there, yes, but the heart of Hiroshima was its people, who woke each morning unaware that their city had been chosen as a target in one of the most consequential military decisions in human history. Nagasaki, too, lived its life largely in rhythm with the ocean, with shipyards, churches, and narrow streets weaving through neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. Neither city knew that their names would one day be synonymous with nuclear devastation. The bombs dropped on these cities were not like the weapons the world had seen before. They represented the culmination of the Manhattan Project, a vast and secret endeavor that had brought together the greatest scientific minds of the era. While the world fought across continents and oceans, in deserts and laboratories, men and women worked relentlessly to create a weapon that could change the balance of power overnight. The irony is not lost on us now. While children in Hiroshima were learning to read, in New Mexico, a desert floor was turned to glass by the first successful detonation of an atomic device. And when that desert test proved successful, a small circle of men began discussing where the real bombs should be dropped. That meeting sealed the fate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though the people living there continued their daily routines, blissfully unaware that invisible decisions had already determined their end. What makes this story uniquely haunting is not only the violence of the explosions, but the ordinariness of life that they interrupted. The morning of August 6th in Hiroshima began with a clear sky. Housewives prepared rice for breakfast. Office workers hurried to catch trains. Students prepared to attend classes. People worried about rations, air raids, and the progress of the war. But not a single person imagined that the sun itself would soon appear to fall upon them. 3 days later, on August 9th, in Nagasaki, the morning followed a similar rhythm. Priests prepared for mass. Shopkeepers opened stalls. Families tended to gardens. Again, no one knew that by midday, the city's cathedral would collapse into rubble, and thousands of lives would end in fire. When you and I think of history, it is easy to focus on the grand maps, the names of leaders, or the ticking clock of battles, but the true story often lies elsewhere in the dust, in the faded photographs, in the fragments of stone that still bear the shadows of those who once stood there. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remind us that history is not only about decisions made in conference rooms, but about the fragile bodies of ordinary people who carried those decisions on their skin, in their lungs, and in their memories for generations. And so, as we begin this journey through 15 parts, I invite you to walk slowly with me. Together, we will not rush to the explosions themselves, but instead trace the long and winding path that led there. We will pause in the lives of those who lived, who died, and who somehow survived. We will follow the threads of the Manhattan Project, the debates inside Japan, the chaos after surrender, and the haunting silence that lingered in both cities long after the fires went out. As you sit with me now, ask yourself, how much of history is shaped not by the great men we read about, but by the ordinary people whose names are forgotten? And when we tell the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, do we remember the victims as individuals, or do we blur them into statistics, into shadows, into numbers too large to hold in the human mind? If you and I are to truly understand what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we cannot simply begin with the explosions themselves. We must step back, far away from the skies of Japan, and look into the deserts of New Mexico, the laboratories of Chicago, and the offices of Washington, where the story of the atomic bomb was quietly taking shape. What unfolded in those years was not merely a race to build a weapon, but a collision of fear, science, politics, and secrecy so deep that many of the very workers involved never knew exactly what they were creating until it was unleashed. The seeds of this weapon were planted long before the Second World War reached its final stages. In the 1930s, scientists in Europe had begun to unravel the mysteries of the atom. The discovery of nuclear fission, that the nucleus of an atom could be split, releasing an almost unimaginable burst of energy, changed physics forever. For centuries, humanity had relied on fire, steam, coal, and oil to fuel its progress. Now, a new energy had been glimpsed, hidden within the very building blocks of matter itself. But discoveries, as you know, rarely sit quietly on the shelf of human knowledge. They are picked up, tested, repurposed, and often weaponized. As the world tumbled into war in 1939, Albert Einstein and fellow physicist Leo Szilard drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning that Nazi Germany might be attempting to harness this new form of power to build an unprecedented bomb. Imagine the weight of that warning, the possibility that Adolf Hitler could possess a weapon capable of destroying entire cities in a single strike. The thought was intolerable, and so the United States, though still hesitant to join the war at that point, began what would become the Manhattan Project, a project so massive that it eventually employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion in 1940s money. a sum that would equal hundreds of billions today. What fascinates me, and perhaps will fascinate you too, are the quiet details of this project. Not just the big explosions and the famous names. Consider this. Many of the workers who built parts of the bomb did not know what they were working on. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, young women operated massive machines, turning dials and recording readings, never told what the purpose was. They were instructed only to keep the numbers steady. These women were unknowingly enriching uranium for the weapon that would fall on Hiroshima. In Hanford, Washington, entire reactors were constructed to produce plutonium, the deadly substance that would fuel the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Workers there lived in hastily constructed barracks, played baseball on makeshift fields, and lined up in cafeterias, all the while surrounded by radioactive materials that would shape the future of warfare. The scientists, of course, knew more. Men like Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr struggled not only with equations and experiments, but with the ethical weight of what they were creating. Oppenheimer, who directed the project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, would later recall a line from ancient scripture after witnessing the first test: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." That test, conducted in July of 1945 in the desert of Alamogordo, proved that the bomb worked. The explosion lit up the desert sky, and the shockwave shattered windows miles away. Scientists who had worked for years in secrecy finally saw their creation come alive. Some cheered, some wept, some stood in silence, unable to decide whether they had just witnessed salvation or damnation. What is often forgotten is that the Manhattan Project was not a single site but a sprawling web of operations. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington, Los Alamos in New Mexico, and smaller facilities scattered across the country all contributed to the effort. Secrecy was so strict that workers could not tell even their spouses what they did each day. Letters were censored, conversations were monitored. The project existed like a ghost across America, hidden in plain sight, consuming enormous resources, and yet invisible to those outside its walls. Imagine being a resident of a small town near Oak Ridge, watching trucks roll in, construction booming, thousands of strangers arriving overnight, and yet being told almost nothing about why. It is easy to assume that such a massive undertaking was driven purely by scientific curiosity, but fear was the greater motivator. The fear that Germany might win the nuclear race. The fear that Japan, though struggling by 1945, could hold out longer, costing hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. The fear that the war, already the deadliest in human history, could drag on into 1946 or beyond. Fear, urgency, and ambition combined to push the project forward. With President Roosevelt's blessing, and later, with President Truman's decisive approval, to use the weapon. You and I must pause here and reflect on something important. The Manhattan Project was a scientific triumph, yes, but it was also a story of ordinary people living within extraordinary secrecy. A farm girl in Tennessee, turning dials on a machine she did not understand. A bus driver in Washington, ferrying workers who carried plutonium in their clothing without even realizing it. A young scientist scribbling formulas late into the night, wondering if his work would change the war or end the world. These are not the faces we see in history textbooks, but without them, there would have been no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, and no nuclear age. And when the first bomb was tested in that New Mexico desert, the world shifted. Those who witnessed it later said it felt as though humanity had crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. One observer wrote that the ground seemed to rise, as if the earth itself recoiled from what had just been unleashed. Another said the light was so intense that he could see the bones in his hand when he held it up in front of his face, like an X-ray. This was not just a weapon. It was a revelation of power that humanity had never wielded before. The question then became, what to do with it? By July of 1945, Germany had already surrendered. Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. and Europe was stumbling into recovery. But Japan fought on, though weakened and cornered. The United States now faced a choice: invade Japan at a cost that military planners estimated could reach 500,000 American casualties, or use the bomb and possibly force a swift surrender. This decision was not made in abstract. It was argued over in offices, in war rooms, in conversations between generals and politicians. And yet, despite the weight of the choice, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not consulted, not warned, not even imagined as individuals in these discussions. To those making the decision, they were targets on a map, statistics in a calculation, objectives in a war. It is chilling to consider that while President Truman and his advisors debated, children in Hiroshima were practicing fire drills, and mothers in Nagasaki were preparing meals. While scientists at Los Alamos pored over test results, shopkeepers in both cities worried about shortages of rice or coal. The paths of these two worlds, one hidden in desert laboratories, the other alive in Japanese neighborhoods, were about to collide with unimaginable force. And so, by early August of 1945, the decision had been made. The bomb would be used. The targets would be chosen. The secrecy that had shrouded the Manhattan Project for years would finally lift, but not in speeches or announcements. It would lift in a blinding flash above Hiroshima, and then again above Nagasaki, revealing to the entire world what had been created in silence and shadow. As you sit with me now, ask yourself, how much of history is shaped by fear, by secrecy, by decisions made in rooms closed to the public? And when we look back on the Manhattan Project, do we see it as a triumph of science, or as the moment when humanity first learned how to destroy itself? Before the morning when Hiroshima became the first city in history to face an atomic attack, it was, in many ways, an ordinary city alive, bustling, fragile, and imperfect. If you had walked through its streets in the summer of 1945, you might have seen a place that did not feel like the center of global events, but rather like a collection of small human rhythms. Shopkeepers raising their shutters, children rushing to school, farmers leading carts through dusty roads, and housewives washing clothes along the riverbanks. This was Hiroshima before the bomb, and to understand the true weight of what happened there, you and I need to spend time in those details. Hiroshima was not just a name on a military map. It was a city of about 350,000 people, crisscrossed by 6 rivers, earning it the nickname the City of Water. The rivers were lined with small boats, wooden bridges, and quiet banks where children sometimes swam despite the summer heat. Narrow streets curved through wooden houses and small shops, while trams rattled along main avenues carrying workers and students. From above, the city formed a fan shape broad at the edges, narrowing toward the center, an unfortunate coincidence that would later amplify the destruction when the bomb detonated above it. Daily life in Hiroshima was touched, of course, by the war. By 1945, Japan had been fighting for years, and the war had stripped away much of the abundance of earlier times. Food was scarce. Rice, once plentiful, had to be rationed, often stretched with barley or sweet potatoes. Families sometimes stood in long lines for meager supplies, carrying small cloth bags and hoping the store would not run out before their turn came. Meat was rare, fish less frequent, and many families learned to live with hunger as a constant companion. Yet, within these constraints, people found ways to continue living. Children played traditional games in the streets. Families gathered around low tables for meals, no matter how modest. Teachers continued lessons in crowded classrooms, where chalk dust mingled with the smell of worn tatami mats. For the children of Hiroshima, the war was both distant and near. They heard of battles fought in islands they could not find on a map, but they also saw soldiers march through the streets. Many schools required their students to contribute to the war effort by working in factories, clearing debris, or preparing fire breaks in case of air raids. Imagine a child, barely in their teens, carrying buckets of sand, or helping to dismantle wooden homes to create empty spaces that might slow the spread of fire if bombs ever fell. These tasks were exhausting and dangerous, yet they were part of daily life. And though the city had been spared the worst of American bombing raids up to that point, everyone knew the war was drawing closer. The sky itself had become a source of unease. Still, in the quiet hours, life retained its patterns. Farmers outside the city rose early to tend to fields of vegetables, leading oxen and carrying tools worn smooth from use. Street vendors called out the prices of fruits, roasted sweet potatoes, and snacks. Bicycles rattled over wooden planks of bridges. In the evenings, families lit small lamps, children studied by dim light, and neighbors gathered to share news, laughter, or silence. Life in Hiroshima carried on, not with the expectation of prosperity, but with the resilience of people who had learned to endure. Religion and tradition also wove themselves into the fabric of the city. Hiroshima had its shrines and temples, places where incense drifted into the air, where people prayed for safety, health, and victory in war. For many, visits to these shrines offered a sense of continuity, a reminder that even in uncertain times, the rituals of the past still held meaning. Festivals, though muted by wartime shortages, were still remembered, and songs were still sung. The human spirit, even in hardship, does not simply dissolve. What is striking, when you think about it, is how invisible the future can be. On the 5th of August, Hiroshima's residents went to bed as they always had. Parents tucked children into futons. Workers prepared for another day at the factory or the office. Soldiers stationed in the city checked their equipment. Priests recited evening prayers. No one knew that a plane had already taken off from an island in the Pacific, carrying a weapon unlike any the world had seen. No one knew that by the next morning, their city would be a charred landscape, and tens of thousands of their neighbors would be gone. History does not always announce itself in advance. It often comes quietly, hidden in the ticking of ordinary hours. There is a particular detail that stays with me. In the city center, near the Ioi Bridge, the T-shaped crossing of two rivers had become a landmark. Children often crossed it on their way to school. Workers walked across it daily. That bridge was chosen as the aiming point for the Enola Gay, the American bomber that carried the atomic bomb. To the military planners, it was a clear, identifiable target. To the people of Hiroshima, it was just a bridge, part of the fabric of daily movement. Imagine the tragic irony. What was once an ordinary crossing of rivers became the precise spot over which the bomb would detonate, turning ordinary lives into casualties of history. And so, on the eve of destruction, Hiroshima was a city not unlike others around the world. Families loved, children played, neighbors quarreled, workers worried about wages, and mothers thought about what to cook with too little rice. Even as the war loomed, there were moments of laughter, of rest, of fragile joy. It is important to remember this, because when we speak of Hiroshima today, we often think only of shadows burned into stone and statistics of the dead. But before the shadows and the numbers, there were living, breathing people, each carrying hopes, fears, and dreams. Perhaps you can imagine yourself there, walking through the narrow streets, hearing the clatter of a vendor's cart, smelling the faint smoke of cooking fires, and feeling the humid August air pressing against your skin. Would you have sensed the weight of history approaching? Or would you, like the residents of Hiroshima, have gone about your day, unaware that time itself was about to split? As you sit with me now, reflect on this. How much of our own daily lives would seem significant if seen from the future? And how many ordinary mornings, like that of Hiroshima in August of 1945, conceal within them the turning points of human history? If Hiroshima was the city of water, spread like a fan across rivers and bridges, Nagasaki was the city of hills and harbors. Long before August of 1945, Nagasaki had been known not only as a bustling port but also as a gateway between Japan and the wider world. Unlike many other Japanese cities, It carried a legacy of foreign contact, of trade, of religion. It was a city of shipyards and churches, of narrow valleys crowded with wooden homes, and of people who lived both with tradition and with echoes of the outside world. To step into Nagasaki before the bomb is to enter a place where history's layers had already been written many times over. Nagasaki's geography shaped its life. The city sat within a series of valleys opening toward a natural harbour, where the waters of the East China Sea carried ships in and out. Hills rose steeply on either side, pressing the city into narrow corridors of streets and neighbourhoods. Wooden houses clung to slopes, pathways twisted upward. Children often climbed steep steps to reach school, while merchants carried their goods down into the market areas. This geography, beautiful in its way, would later play a role in limiting the spread of the atomic bomb's destruction, for the hills would shield parts of the city. Yet for the people living there in early August of 1945, the hills were not defences. They were simply the backdrop of daily life. Nagasaki's port gave it a character unlike that of Hiroshima. For centuries, it had been one of the few places in Japan open to foreign trade during times when the country closed itself to outsiders. Dutch traders once had a small island settlement there, bringing with them goods, books, and ideas. Catholic missionaries, centuries earlier, had left their mark too, building churches and converting local followers. Though Christianity had faced persecution in Japan, Nagasaki remained home to one of the largest Christian communities in the country. The Urakami Cathedral, standing proudly in the city, was a symbol of that presence, a place where bells rang on Sundays, where families gathered for Mass, and where faith continued despite the tides of history. It was in this cathedral that many prayed in early August, never knowing it would soon be reduced to rubble by a weapon they could not imagine. By 1945, Nagasaki was also an industrial hub. Shipyards lined the harbour, employing thousands of workers to build and repair vessels for the Japanese war effort. Factories produced weapons, machinery, and supplies. Workers in overalls walked through the gates each morning, their lunch wrapped in cloth bundles. The rhythm of whistles and hammering echoed across the valley. This industrial role made Nagasaki a potential military target in the eyes of American planners, though to the people living there, it was simply where fathers, brothers, and sons went each day to earn wages. Yet, beyond the smoke of the factories and the clang of the shipyards, Nagasaki was still a city of families. Housewives carried baskets through narrow markets, where stalls offered vegetables, fish, or handmade goods. Children played in alleys, their laughter rising above the clatter of streetcars. Neighbours exchanged greetings at wells and along stairways. In small gardens, despite shortages, people grew vegetables to supplement rations. Life, though constrained by war, retained its ordinary textures. Rice was rationed, clothing worn thin, and air raid sirens were a familiar sound. But within the city, resilience continued. People married, children were born, prayers were said, and meals, no matter how small, were shared. What makes Nagasaki's story particularly poignant is how normal it all seemed on the eve of catastrophe. On August 8th, the day before the bomb fell, families went about their routines. Priests prepared sermons, children studied, workers clocked in and out of the factories. Housewives worried over the scarcity of cooking oil or the rising price of sweet potatoes. It was a city at war, yes, but also a city alive with small acts of living. No one suspected that within 24 hours, a bomb nicknamed Fat Man would fall through its skies, carrying a force equal to more than 20,000 tons of TNT. One can imagine standing in the Urakami district on that evening, hearing the bells of the cathedral, watching children chase one another up the stone steps, and seeing lanterns flicker to life as the sun set behind the hills. What could possibly have hinted at the destruction about to arrive? The skies were ordinary, the streets familiar, the routines unbroken. Even though Japan had suffered months of bombing in other cities, Tokyo, Osaka, and many others, The people of Nagasaki had not yet faced devastation on that scale. Their city was not empty of fear, but it had not been marked as uniquely doomed. And yet, behind closed doors on the other side of the world, decisions had already been made. Maps had been marked, targets chosen. Nagasaki had not been the first choice. In fact, it was a substitute target, selected when weather obscured the skies above Kokura, the city originally marked for destruction. This chance of clouds and timing, these invisible whims of nature and planning, would decide that Nagasaki, not Kokura, would bear the blast. To the people of Nagasaki, this chain of decisions and weather patterns was hidden. To them, life continued with the stubborn persistence of the human spirit. The irony of Nagasaki's fate is sharpened by its religious character. Among its Christian community, faith had endured centuries of suppression, only to be devastated in a single morning by a bomb that obliterated the Urakami Cathedral. Survivors would later describe statues of saints buried in rubble, crucifixes scorched by heat, and worshippers who perished as they prayed. But on the evening before, those bells still rang, families still gathered, and the walls still stood. If you and I pause here, in this moment before destruction, it is worth remembering that history is often carried forward, not by the noise of war, but by the silence of ordinary days. The people of Nagasaki did not know they were standing at the edge of history. They thought of school exams, of family quarrels, of what to cook for supper. They thought of wages, of ration coupons, of repairing shoes. Their concerns were small but vital, the everyday burdens of life in wartime Japan. And in that ordinariness lies the greatest tragedy. That ordinary lives, filled with ordinary worries, were erased by a weapon born from extraordinary ambition. Perhaps you can picture yourself standing at the harbour that night, listening to the creak of wooden boats tied along the docks, smelling the salt in the air, watching lights flicker across the water. Would you have sensed what was coming? Or would you, like the residents of Nagasaki, have trusted in the normalcy of tomorrow? As you reflect on this, ask yourself, when history looks back at our own lives, will it see only the grand events, or will it remember the quiet, ordinary moments that truly make us human? And how often do we realize that the most ordinary of days can be the ones after which nothing is ever the same again? The 6th of August, 1945, began like any other summer morning in Hiroshima. The air was already warm, heavy with humidity, and the sun rose over the city's rivers and wooden rooftops, casting its light on a place that did not yet know it was living its last hours as it had always been. For the residents, this day was to be filled with routines so familiar they hardly noticed them until, in an instant, the ordinary was torn away forever. Picture the city as the morning unfolded. Housewives lit small fires in their kitchens, preparing rice mixed with barley, a meager breakfast in a time when food shortages had become routine. Children washed their faces, straightened their uniforms, and hurried off to schools or work assignments, some carrying tools rather than books, for many students had been mobilized to help clear fire breaks against possible air raids. Workers adjusted their caps, tucked lunches into cloth bundles, and boarded trams that clattered down the narrow streets toward offices, factories, and military facilities. The rhythm of life continued, marked by footsteps on wooden bridges and the sound of bicycle bells. In the harbour, small boats drifted lazily, their sails catching the morning breeze. Farmers from nearby villages led their carts into the markets, carrying vegetables to sell. Street vendors prepared for the day, calling out prices of roasted sweet potatoes and fish. The scent of miso soup wafted from homes, mingling with the smell of dust and summer heat. There was little to suggest that history was about to divide itself here into a before and an after. Somewhere in the city centre, near the Aoi Bridge, people were already crossing to reach shops or workplaces. The bridge, with its distinctive T-shape, was simply part of their daily paths. Children laughed as they skipped across, unaware that military planners thousands of miles away had selected that very spot as the aiming point for a weapon no one in Hiroshima could imagine. In homes scattered across the city, small dramas of ordinary life played out. A mother scolded her son for being late. A father, on leave from military duty, shared breakfast with his family. A young couple whispered plans about the future, even as war threatened it. Grandparents watched over small children, fanning themselves against the rising heat. These quiet, invisible moments of daily life were the essence of Hiroshima that morning. Ordinary, fragile, human. What makes the 6th of August so haunting is the innocence of those routines. The war was very real to the people of Hiroshima. Rationing, military drills, and constant fear of air raids had shaped their lives. But on this morning, no air raid sirens sounded. In fact, the early sighting of a small number of American planes overhead had not caused alarm. Residents had grown used to the ebb and flow of aircraft, and many assumed these planes were only on reconnaissance missions. The city had been spared the mass firebombings that had devastated Tokyo and Osaka, so there was no reason to believe Hiroshima would become a target on this particular day. Children made their way to schools, some carrying buckets and shovels to help dismantle wooden structures for fire breaks. These tasks were tiresome, but they gave students a sense of responsibility, of helping the nation. Teachers gathered their pupils, unaware that in a few short hours, classrooms would no longer exist. Workers at the Mitsubishi factory prepared for shifts, the clang of machinery echoing through the building. Clerks walked to their offices, carrying documents and ledgers. Priests prepared for morning prayers in shrines and temples. At the same time, in the skies far above, the Enola Gay, an American B-29 bomber, was already on its way. Loaded with a bomb nicknamed Little Boy, the plane cut silently across the morning air, unseen and unnoticed by those below. Its target was already set, the heart of Hiroshima. Yet on the ground, no one looked up with suspicion. They carried on as though time would continue as it always had. There is something deeply unsettling in this contrast. The ordinariness of life below and the extraordinary destruction above, moving slowly toward them. A boy tying his shoelace in the street. A young girl chasing her dog. A merchant sweeping dust from his storefront. Each of them was living within a story whose ending had already been written, though they did not know it. If you pause for a moment, imagine yourself walking through Hiroshima that morning. You feel the heat rising from the cobblestones, hear the chatter of children, see laundry fluttering on clotheslines. You might stop at a market stall, hand over a few coins for a piece of fruit, and continue on your way. Nothing would feel out of place. The air would be heavy, but no heavier than any other August day. And yet, overhead, history was descending. It is important to remember that Hiroshima was not a city of soldiers alone. It was home to families, to children, to elderly citizens who had already endured too much war. When we speak of August 6th, it is easy to lose sight of this humanity and think only of statistics. 70,000 killed instantly, another 70,000 dying later from injuries and radiation. But before those numbers, there were individuals. The schoolgirl brushing her hair, the grandmother folding futons, the shopkeeper counting coins. They were not expecting war to end their lives that morning. As the clock moved toward 8:15, life in Hiroshima still pulsed with its quiet rhythm. Students gathered in classrooms, workers settled at their stations, housewives poured tea, soldiers carried out drills, children laughed in the streets. It was a city alive, unaware it was standing on the edge of a moment that would echo through centuries. And so, the morning continued, ordinary, fragile, and brief. In less than a minute, everything would change. As you sit with me now, ask yourself, what does it mean that the greatest turning points in history often arrive on the most ordinary of mornings? And if you had lived in Hiroshima that day, would you have noticed anything at all? Any whisper, any shadow that hinted at what was about to descend from the sky? At 8:15 in the morning on the 6th of August, 1945, the ordinary rhythm of Hiroshima ended. The Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber named after the mother of its pilot, Paul Tibbets, flew high above the city. From the streets below, the plane looked like nothing more than a silver glint in the sunlight, too distant to seem dangerous. For those walking to work, cooking breakfast, or chatting on corners, there was no sense that history's first atomic weapon was about to fall upon them. Inside the Enola Gay, the crew went about their tasks with the precision of men trained for something they had practiced but never truly experienced. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, weighed over 9,000 pounds and contained enriched uranium. Its design was crude by later standards, but powerful enough to unleash energy beyond imagination. When the bomb bay doors opened, a simple mechanical action took place, metal releasing metal, but that release began a chain of events that would alter the course of humanity. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the bomb dropped. For 43 seconds it fell silently, cutting through the morning sky, unnoticed by most of the people below. It tumbled past rooftops and gardens, past temples and markets, heading toward the aiming point near the Ayoi Bridge. A few looked upward, puzzled by the sight of a single object falling, but most paid it no attention. In a city accustomed to military aircraft, one more speck in the sky did not seem alarming. Then, in an instant, the world split apart. At an altitude of about 1,900 feet, Little Boy detonated. The first sensation was light, not ordinary sunlight, but a flash so intense it erased all shadows. Survivors later described it as a blinding white radiance, brighter than 1,000 suns. For those standing directly beneath the explosion, the light burned their skin instantly. People vanished where they stood, leaving only outlines, dark shadows seared into stone steps and bridge walls. The heat came next. Temperatures near the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. Wooden houses burst into flames instantly, roof tiles melted, clothing caught fire where it touched the body. Those within half a mile of the explosion were simply consumed. Many were vaporized, leaving no trace at all. And then came the shockwave. A massive wall of pressure expanded outward faster than sound, tearing through the city in all directions. Houses collapsed like paper, bridges buckled, trees snapped like twigs, windows shattered miles away. People were thrown through the air, crushed beneath beams, buried in rubble. The blast wave carried fire with it, igniting everything combustible, creating a firestorm that would rage across the city. In that first minute, tens of thousands of lives ended. Those farther from the hypocenter survived the blast but were left horribly injured. Skin hung from their bodies in strips. Eyes were blinded. Burns covered flesh. People staggered through streets that no longer existed, calling for water, stumbling past corpses, searching for family. The silence of the morning was gone, replaced by screams, crackling fire, and the strange, eerie wind of the explosion's aftermath. The Enola Gay, by then miles away, shuddered from the shockwave. Paul Tibbets looked back and saw a towering mushroom cloud rising into the sky. The crew stared in silence, awestruck and horrified by the sight. Below, Hiroshima had become an inferno. What makes this moment difficult to grasp is not only the scale of destruction, but also its suddenness. 1 second, a city of 300,000 lived its routines. The next second, tens of thousands were gone, and the survivors were trapped in a nightmare of fire, rubble, and radiation. The city's geography, once marked by rivers and bridges, was now a flat expanse of smouldering ruins. In temples and shrines that had stood for centuries, priests and worshippers lay dead. Schools collapsed on students. Hospitals, meant to heal, became places of death. Even animals, dogs, cats, birds were caught in the firestorm, leaving behind only silence. Radiation, invisible and incomprehensible at the time, spread outward with the cloud. People who appeared unhurt soon began to bleed from gums and noses. Hair fell out. Fevers raged. Those who entered the city to help would later suffer the same fate. It was a weapon whose effects did not end with the explosion. And yet, amidst the horror, Survivors clung to life. A mother carried her burned child through the ruins. A soldier dug frantically through rubble to free a comrade. Strangers shared sips of water, knowing it was the only comfort left. Priests gathered the injured, praying aloud as the city burned around them. Human resilience, fragile though it was, flickered even in the shadow of destruction. From the outside world, Hiroshima disappeared in an instant. Pilots reported back to command. The mission was complete. The bomb had detonated as planned. For the leaders in Washington and Tokyo, this was a strategic act, a demonstration of power meant to hasten the war's end. But for the people on the ground, it was not strategy. It was survival, suffering, and the collapse of everything they had known. As the mushroom cloud rose higher, spreading ash and debris across the sky, a new age began, the nuclear age. The weapon unleashed on Hiroshima was unlike any before it, and it would not be the last. And so we pause here, in the silence after the blast, to reflect on what it meant for ordinary people to live through this moment. What would you have done if you were there? Emerging from the rubble, searching for water, calling out for family. Would survival have felt like hope, or would it have felt like despair in a world suddenly unrecognizable? Survival in Hiroshima, on the morning of August 6th, 1945, was less a matter of luck than of geography. Those who happened to be behind a stone wall, or underground in a cellar, or simply farther from the hypercenter, sometimes lived. But life after the flash was not the same life they had known before. Survival carried its own weight, marked by burns, thirst, radiation, and the haunting loss of everyone around them. The first thing many survivors remembered was silence. After the blinding flash and the roar of the blast, there was a strange stillness, as though the world had paused in shock. Dust filled the air, blocking the sun, turning morning into twilight. Then came the cries, screams for help, pleas for water, shouts for missing family. A city of voices rose out of the rubble, voices broken by pain and desperation. People stumbled through streets that no longer existed, their skin burned, their clothes in tatters. Survivors described bodies so charred they could not tell if they were alive or dead. Some people held their arms outstretched because the skin hung from them in strips, too painful to let touch their bodies. Others, dazed and silent, walked aimlessly with vacant eyes, their minds unable to comprehend what had happened. Water became an obsession. The blast had ignited fires across the city, and smoke darkened the sky. The heat was unbearable, and the injured thirsted for relief. Survivors fled toward the rivers, plunging into them for coolness, many too weak to climb out again. Along the banks, bodies piled up, some drowned, some dead from burns, others simply collapsed from exhaustion. Children called out, "Mizu, Mizu, water, water," their voices echoing through the ruined streets. Hospitals, themselves destroyed, became scenes of unimaginable suffering. The few doctors and nurses who survived worked frantically, but with no medicine, no supplies, and no buildings intact, there was little they could do. Bandages were torn from curtains, wounds washed with dirty water, morphine non-existent. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia. Priests prayed with the dying, often dying themselves from burns and radiation. And yet, amid the chaos, acts of compassion appeared. A man carried his neighbor's child, searching for her parents. Teachers led groups of injured students to safer ground, even when their own injuries slowed them. Soldiers formed rescue teams, digging survivors from collapsed buildings. Women shared scraps of food or cups of water, knowing they might not live to see the next day themselves. Humanity flickered through the ruins like sparks in ash. For many survivors, the search for loved ones defined those first hours. Parents wandered through rubble calling for children. Children searched for mothers or fathers, guided only by memory of where their homes had stood. In many cases, entire families were gone, erased in an instant. Survivors spoke of recognizing friends only by their voices, for their faces were too burned to be recognized. The destruction of landmarks disoriented everyone. The Aioi Bridge, once a familiar crossing point, was twisted and broken. The Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, its dome shattered, stood amid rubble as one of the few structures partially upright. Streets had vanished, replaced by smouldering expanses where wooden houses had stood. Those who had lived their whole lives in Hiroshima suddenly did not know where they were. Radiation, still unknown to the victims, was already at work. People who had seemed uninjured collapsed suddenly with vomiting and weakness. Cuts bled without stopping. Strange purple spots appeared on skin. Survivors could not understand this invisible sickness. They only knew their strength drained away, and that those who had walked alongside them sometimes fell dead without warning. At night, the fires glowed across the ruins, turning the sky red. Survivors huddled together in open spaces, fearful of more attacks. Some prayed aloud, others sat in silence, unable to speak. Children clung to strangers, orphaned in a single day. Soldiers tried to establish order, but there was little left to command. The city was a ruin, its people broken, its government offices destroyed, its officials dead or scattered. And still, even in this devastation, life found ways to continue. Mothers soothed their children with whispered words, though they had no food or shelter to offer. Doctors kept working until they collapsed from exhaustion. Priests lit candles among the ruins and recited prayers. Survivors formed small groups, helping one another move towards safer ground outside the city. Even when survival seemed impossible, people did what they could to keep one another alive. What is striking, when you listen to survivors' accounts, is how ordinary their thoughts remained amid the extraordinary horror. They remembered being thirsty, or worried about the whereabouts of their families, or feeling shame at being half-dressed in public after their clothes had burned away. In the shadow of an event that reshaped history, their concerns remained human, simple, and familiar. It reminds us that history is not only about nations and armies, it is about individuals trying to live through days they never imagined. By dawn the next morning, Hiroshima was no longer a city but a smouldering graveyard. Yet thousands still lived, scarred and sick, clinging to survival. They did not yet know that their suffering was not finished, that radiation would continue to take lives in the weeks and months ahead. For now, they only knew thirst, hunger, pain, and the endless search for someone they loved. And so, the survivors of Hiroshima stood at the edge of a new world, one that had been forced upon them without warning. They carried burns that would never heal, memories that would never fade, and questions that no answer could satisfy. If you had survived that morning, crawling out from rubble with burns on your skin and ash in your lungs, what would you have done next? Would you have searched for water, for family, for shelter? Or would you have stood still, stunned, unable to believe that an entire city could disappear in a single instant? The 9th of August, 1945, began in Nagasaki as a day like many others. The war had stretched on for years. Rationing and shortages had worn people down, and yet ordinary life persisted. Unlike Hiroshima, which was largely administrative and military, Nagasaki was an industrial port city. Its shipyards and factories had made it a target, but its valleys and hills gave residents the sense of being protected, tucked into the folds of Kyushu's rugged landscape. That morning, people woke to routines that felt normal. Though the war pressed close on every side, dawn broke over the Urakami Valley, where farmers tended their small plots, pulling vegetables from the ground to take to market. Women carried water from wells, preparing breakfast for families, rice mixed with barley, miso soup stretched thin, and sometimes dried fish if fortune allowed. Children, thinner now than they had been before the war, still laughed as they tied their sandals and hurried off to schools or work programs. In the neighborhoods near the Mitsubishi factories, workers prepared for shifts. Some walked toward the shipyard, while others made their way to the munitions plants that kept the Japanese war machine alive. A few complained quietly about long hours or aching backs, but most simply accepted that work had to be done. The sound of hammers and machines soon filled the valley. In Nagasaki's churches, priests prepared for morning prayers. The city had a unique history compared to the rest of Japan. It had long been a center of Christian influence, dating back to Portuguese traders in the 16th century. Even after centuries of suppression, Nagasaki remained home to a vibrant Christian community. On the morning of August 9th, bells rang in chapels, calling the faithful to worship. For many, prayer had become the only comfort left as the war's hardships deepened. Street vendors set up their stalls, arranging vegetables, fish, and household items. Housewives with ration cards tucked into sleeves lined up for whatever food was available that day. In tea shops, men gathered to talk about the war, though their voices carried less certainty than before. Rumors spread. Some said Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb 3 days earlier, though few believed it. The idea seemed impossible. How could one weapon do what entire fleets of bombers had done elsewhere? Many assumed it was propaganda or exaggeration. And so, the morning continued with its ordinariness. Children crossed bridges over the Nakashima River. Tramcars rattled down streets. Fishermen returned with their catches, unloading crates by the waterfront. Mothers swept doorsteps, folding laundry as cicadas buzzed in the heat. The city breathed its routine, unaware that an American bomber was already in the sky, carrying a second atomic bomb. Far above the Earth, the crew of the B-29 named Boxcar flew toward their original target, the city of Kokura. But heavy smoke and clouds obscured Kokura, making accurate bombing impossible. After circling multiple times, risking fuel and detection, the crew made the decision to divert to their secondary target, Nagasaki. It was a fateful choice. On the ground, no one in Nagasaki knew that their city had become the substitute, chosen because of weather. At around 10 o'clock that morning, an air raid alert briefly sounded. People glanced upward, wary but not panicked. Small groups of planes had been spotted before, and the warning was lifted quickly. The all-clear signal allowed life to continue. Housewives returned to washing rice, children to their lessons, workers to their machines. Few gave it further thought. In the Urakami district, children played outside schools. In the Mitsubishi arms plant, workers checked machinery, tightening bolts, hauling metal. At the Nagasaki Medical College, doctors and nurses began their rounds. Students gathered for lectures. The hum of ordinary life vibrated across the valley, blending footsteps, voices, and machines into the rhythm of a summer morning. There was no sense of doom in the air. Unlike Hiroshima, which was flat and open, Nagasaki's geography offered a sense of shelter. Hills rose steeply on all sides, and valleys folded inward. Residents had long believed this terrain would protect them from the worst of air raids. Indeed, the city had not suffered the same scale of destruction that other Japanese cities had endured. People carried on with the quiet confidence that their valley made them less vulnerable, and yet, fate was already descending. The bomb carried by Boxcar, nicknamed Fat Man, was more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. A plutonium weapon, its design represented a leap in destructive capability. As the plane approached Nagasaki, the crew prepared to release the bomb over the city, but on the ground, time moved gently forward. The scent of miso lingered in kitchens. A teacher called children to order in a classroom. A grandmother folded laundry and hummed softly. A priest raised his hands in prayer. Small, invisible acts of daily life unfolded with quiet dignity, unaware that they were about to be swept away. What makes these mornings so haunting is their ordinariness. No one wakes expecting their world to end. People argue about breakfast, scold children for tardiness, think about errands. Even when war hovers, routine shields the mind. In Nagasaki on August 9th, survival felt normal until, in a single instant, it would no longer exist. And so, Nagasaki's morning of life continued. unaware of what was already falling from the sky. If you imagine yourself there, walking across a bridge, hearing the clang of shipyard hammers, smelling fish at the market, would anything have felt unusual? Would you have sensed the shadow overhead? Or would you have believed, like most, that another day had simply begun? At exactly 11 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning on the 9th of August, 1945, the people of Nagasaki looked up into a sky that held no warning. The all-clear siren had sounded, daily routines had resumed, and the valley echoed with the ordinary hum of work, prayer, and play. Yet above them, unseen, the B-29 bomber named Boxcar prepared to release the second atomic weapon ever used in war. The bomb carried that day was different from the one dropped on Hiroshima. Fat Man, as it was called, was a plutonium device, heavier, more complex, and more powerful than Little Boy. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, and its design relied on implosion plutonium, squeezed inward by explosives to trigger a nuclear chain reaction. The crew aboard Boxcar had been briefed. If it worked as intended, it would unleash destruction on a scale beyond comprehension. At 11 o'clock and 2 minutes, the bomb was released. It fell silently for nearly 50 seconds, spinning as it dropped through clouds, heading toward the Urakami Valley. Unlike Hiroshima, where the aiming point had been clear, Nagasaki's hilly terrain complicated the target. The bomb drifted from its original aim, missing the center of the city, and detonated about 1,600 feet above the ground, roughly midway between the Mitsubishi Arms plant and the Urakami Cathedral. The explosion that followed tore through the valley with unimaginable force. A flash of blinding white light seared the sky, so intense that those who looked directly at it were blinded. Heat followed, hotter than the sun, igniting wood, melting metal, burning skin instantly. Houses and shops vanished in fire. Stone buildings cracked and collapsed. The great Urakami Cathedral, once the largest Christian church in East Asia, crumbled into ruin within seconds, burying worshippers beneath its shattered walls. The shockwave raced outward, flattening everything within a radius of nearly 2 miles. People were thrown into the air, crushed under beams, impaled by flying debris. Hills and rivers contained the blast to some extent, but within the valley itself, destruction was total. The once vibrant neighborhoods of Urakami were reduced to ash and rubble. For those at the hypocenter, survival was almost impossible. Yet beyond the immediate radius, people staggered away, burned, bleeding, dazed. Their stories mirror those of Hiroshima, but carry their own haunting details. Survivors describe children burned beyond recognition, parents carrying lifeless infants, people with skin peeling in strips as they stumbled toward the rivers. The smell of charred flesh filled the air, mingling with smoke from burning houses. The Mitsubishi factories, though partially shielded by hills, suffered heavy damage. Workers inside were killed instantly or left with devastating injuries. Students conscripted to work, they were among the dead. Their lives ended in an instant. The medical college and hospital were destroyed, killing doctors and patients alike, leaving the injured with no care. In the moments after the blast, the valley became a landscape of fire and screams. Survivors crawled from ruins, their eyes searching for water, their voices hoarse from dust and heat. Some wandered in silence, stunned beyond words. Others prayed aloud, calling on gods and ancestors. Children cried for mothers who were no longer there. Families were torn apart, many never to be reunited. The mushroom cloud rose above Nagasaki, climbing miles into the sky, visible for more than 100 miles away. On board Boxcar, the crew watched as the city disappeared into a swelling column of fire and ash. They had accomplished their mission, but below, the meaning of that mission was written in human suffering. Unlike Hiroshima, where the city was flat and open, Nagasaki's hills created strange patterns of destruction. Some areas were completely obliterated, while others, shielded by ridges, survived with less damage. This unevenness gave survivors brief illusions of safety. only to reveal horror when they ventured into neighboring valleys. It also meant that more people lived to tell of Nagasaki's devastation, though their memories were filled with images of unbearable loss. Radiation spread invisibly through the valley. Survivors who had escaped the blast with minor injuries soon developed fevers, vomiting, and bleeding. Families who found each other again often lost one another days later to radiation sickness. Doctors, few as they were, could not explain the symptoms. To them, it was a mystery, an invisible poison that killed even after the fires had burned out. One of the most haunting losses that day was the destruction of the Urakami Cathedral. Generations of hidden Christians had prayed in secret during Japan's centuries of persecution, and when at last they were free to worship openly, the cathedral became a symbol of survival. On that morning, as prayers rose inside, the bomb obliterated it in an instant. Survivors later spoke of their faith being tested beyond measure, yet many continued to pray amid the ruins, their voices trembling but unbroken. By the end of that day, tens of thousands were dead, and many more would die in the weeks ahead. The city that had believed its valleys made it safe was shattered. Smoke and ash filled the air, fires burned through the night, and silence returned only when exhaustion overcame the voices of the suffering. From the perspective of military planners, the mission had succeeded. The bomb had detonated as intended, demonstrating to Japan's leaders that Hiroshima had not been a single isolated event. But on the ground, strategy meant nothing. What mattered was survival, and survival was a desperate struggle in a city that had ceased to exist. And so, Nagasaki joined Hiroshima in a new and terrible chapter of human history. Its people bore the scars, burns, sickness, loss that would mark their lives forever. They became witnesses to the dawn of the nuclear age, not by choice, but by fate. If you imagine yourself there, standing in the valley when the light flashed, what would you have done? Would you have run, prayed, searched for water, or simply stood still, unable to understand what had happened? And what would survival mean in a world where everything you knew was gone in a single instant? Survival in Nagasaki, on the morning of August 9th, 1945, was a fragile, almost miraculous act. For those who were not at the hypercenter, the immediate aftermath was chaotic, terrifying, and incomprehensible. People crawled through rubble, burned and bleeding, searching desperately for water, family, and shelter. The city, nestled in valleys and hills, had been shattered, leaving survivors in a labyrinth of ash, collapsed houses, and twisted steel. The first moments were dominated by confusion. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks that had guided daily life. The Urakami Cathedral, the Mitsubishi factory gates, bridges over the Nakashima River were destroyed or obscured by fire and smoke. Survivors stumbled blindly, calling out names of relatives or friends who might have been nearby. Some recognized the voices of neighbors, only to find the person had been injured or worse. Children clung to strangers, searching for safety in the arms of those who could guide them through the ruin. Fires raged across the city, fed by wooden houses and strong summer winds. Smoke filled the air, choking those who were burned but still alive. Many tried to reach the rivers for relief, but debris blocked paths, and in some cases, the water itself was too far or too hot from the surrounding firestorm. Survivors described the air as thick with ash and dust, a suffocating blanket that seemed determined to claim every breath. Injuries were gruesome. Burns covered the body in patches or strips. Some people had been thrown into walls or rubble, leaving fractures and broken bones. Others had clothes burned to cinders, leaving skin charred or peeled. Blood ran in rivulets down arms and legs. People wandered dazed, their minds unable to process the scale of destruction. Amid this chaos, ordinary instincts of survival, finding water, seeking shelter, protecting children, drove every action. Hospitals, like in Hiroshima, were largely destroyed. The few medical personnel who survived worked tirelessly with minimal supplies. Bandages were torn from curtains, Water used to clean wounds was often contaminated, and anesthesia was unavailable. Doctors improvised constantly, performing amputations or treating burns without proper instruments. The sheer number of injured overwhelmed every effort. Survivors often had to rely on one another for care, sharing what little water, food, or support they could muster. Family reunions became desperate searches. Parents combed through debris, calling the names of children they hoped were alive. Children wandered the ruins looking for parents, clutching the few personal belongings that survived the blast. Many found themselves alone, wandering streets that had been homes, schools, and markets just hours before. Every step was a negotiation with life itself, balancing the risk of collapsed buildings, fire, and further injury. The Urakami Cathedral, once a place of worship and community, became a pile of rubble. Generations of Christians who had prayed there in secret during centuries of persecution now lay among its ruins. Some survivors crawled through the debris, searching for family members who had been inside, finding only scorched wood and broken statues. Faith, for many, became both a source of comfort and a profound test. Those who survived prayed amid ashes, wondering why they had lived while others had not. Geography played a role in survival. Nagasaki's hills and valleys, while contributing to destruction in some areas, shielded other neighborhoods from the full force of the bomb. Some people lived just beyond the primary blast radius, spared from instant death, though still injured by heat, fire, and debris. These survivors emerged to a city unrecognizable, carrying the memory of the ordinary world that had existed only hours before. Acts of compassion persisted, even in the chaos. Survivors helped one another move from burning buildings, shared what water they could find, and guided the injured towards safer spaces. Soldiers, although disoriented themselves, tried to organize rescue efforts. Teachers and priests led groups of children through the ruins. Even amidst despair, small gestures of humanity survived, a testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming devastation. Radiation, unseen and poorly understood, became a hidden threat. Many who seemed only slightly injured began to deteriorate hours or days later. Hair fell out, gums bled, and fevers raged. Families that had found each other shortly after the blast often lost loved ones in the weeks that followed. Doctors and nurses, unable to understand the cause, struggled against a silent killer, working tirelessly without knowledge of the invisible hazard. By the evening of August 9th, Nagasaki resembled a ghost city. Fires continued to burn, smoke hung low over the valleys, and survivors gathered in open spaces, exhausted and disoriented. Children slept amidst rubble, leaning on strangers. Adults sought shade or shelter, nursing burns and injuries. Prayer, murmured conversations, and quiet weeping replaced the ordinary noises of the morning. The valley was transformed, its familiar geography reduced to a landscape of horror and survival. Yet, even in such conditions, some semblance of community persisted. Survivors shared resources, directed each other to safer areas, and tried to account for neighbors or relatives. In this, one sees the stubborn persistence of ordinary human behavior. Even when a city has been obliterated, people still care for one another, still try to find order amidst chaos. The scale of death was staggering. Estimates suggest that immediately following the bombing, between 40,000 and 70,000 people were killed. Many more would succumb to injuries or radiation sickness in the following weeks. Every survivor carried with them the memory of friends, family, and neighbors lost in an instant, a burden both physical and emotional. In the quiet moments, survivors described hearing echoes of normal life, children calling for parents, distant footsteps, and voices repeating familiar phrases, all of which contrasted sharply with the devastation surrounding them. The ordinary, fractured and interrupted, became a haunting reminder of what had been lost. As you imagine yourself there, emerging from rubble with burns, ash in your lungs, and grief pressing on your chest. What would you do next? Would you search for family, for water, for shelter? Would you pray, scream, or simply walk in stunned silence? And how would survival feel in a world where everything you knew, the streets, the houses, the rhythm of daily life, had vanished in a single instant? The world outside Japan awoke in the aftermath of the atomic bombings with a mixture of shock, awe, and disbelief. For the first time in history, a single weapon had destroyed entire cities, ending lives by the tens of thousands in moments. International reactions were immediate, though often filtered through the lens of war and politics. In Washington, London, Moscow, and other capitals, officials tried to interpret the significance of events they could scarcely imagine. In the United States, where the bombs had been developed in secret under the Manhattan Project, initial reports were met with a combination of triumph and unease. President Harry Truman addressed the nation on the evening of August 6th, describing the bombing of Hiroshima as a military necessity, a way to bring a swift end to the war, and to save countless American lives that would otherwise be lost in a land invasion. He spoke of the new weapon of unusual destructive force, without fully capturing the scale of human suffering beneath the statement. Military officials and planners in the United States viewed the success of the bomb as confirmation of technological and strategic achievement. They studied photographs taken by reconnaissance planes, noted the extent of destruction, and recorded casualty estimates. Reports emphasized the immediate impact: buildings flattened, fires raging, military installations destroyed. Yet in the initial assessments, human suffering, though acknowledged, was often framed as collateral to a larger strategic objective. Across the Atlantic, London's government responded with cautious optimism. British officials, having contributed to aspects of nuclear research, understood the weapon's destructive potential. Newspapers reported the bombings with a mixture of admiration for technological achievement and unease about the future implications. The press speculated on what this meant for post-war power dynamics. Questions arose. Could the bomb prevent further land invasions of Japan? Would its use redefine warfare forever? In Moscow, the reaction was markedly different. Soviet leaders, already wary of American intentions, viewed the bomb as a demonstration of power. Joseph Stalin and his advisors realized that the atomic bomb could dramatically shift the balance in post-war negotiations. The USSR accelerated its own research into nuclear weapons, seeing the bomb not merely as a military instrument, but as a geopolitical lever. While Japanese suffering was noted in reports, the primary focus for Moscow was strategic advantage and planning for the post-war era. Japan itself was left reeling. News of Hiroshima spread slowly at first, shrouded in confusion and censorship. Reports described devastation but lacked details, leaving many unsure whether the city still existed or what had truly occurred. Survivors who traveled to other cities tried to recount what they had seen, but their words were often met with disbelief. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible, even to those who had witnessed the firebombings of Tokyo and Osaka. The second bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th compounded shock and despair, demonstrating that the atomic bomb was not an isolated event, but a new reality of war. Within the Japanese government, military and civilian leaders debated next steps. Emperor Hirohito and his advisors faced unprecedented decisions. The bombings, combined with conventional defeats, and the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, created a crisis of survival. Some military officials advocated continuing resistance, while others argued that surrender was the only path to prevent further annihilation. The bombings had created both a practical and psychological tipping point. Cities destroyed in moments, millions threatened by a weapon beyond human comprehension. News agencies around the world struggled to convey the events accurately. Photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed flattened landscapes, smoke rising, and human shadows burned into stone. Newspapers described casualties with numbers: tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands more injured, but numbers could not fully communicate the horror. readers were confronted with a reality that was both factual and surreal. For many, the bombs confirmed the terrifying power of modern science when applied to warfare. In the United States, reactions among the public were a mixture of pride, fear, and disbelief. Newspapers hailed the bomb as a tool to end the war quickly. Families of soldiers welcomed news that an invasion of Japan might be avoided, saving countless American lives. Yet letters from missionaries, journalists, and diplomats in Japan described harrowing scenes of suffering, presenting an ethical dilemma that some Americans could not reconcile with military success. The moral implications of targeting civilians with such unprecedented force began to emerge in public discussion, though debates would intensify only in the years to come. International leaders also grappled with the idea that warfare had entered an entirely new phase. The atomic bomb was no longer a distant possibility. It was an immediate reality. Scholars, strategists, and politicians began to discuss deterrence, arms races, and the responsibilities of possessing such a weapon. Questions emerged that would dominate global politics for decades. Who should have control of nuclear technology? How could the world prevent its further use? Could humanity survive when individuals or nations possessed the power to destroy entire cities in moments? Humanitarian organizations, though limited in immediate response, documented the physical and psychological toll on survivors. Relief efforts struggled against destruction and radiation sickness, highlighting the unprecedented challenges created by nuclear warfare. Medical teams observed burns unlike any they had treated before, radiation-induced illnesses, and survivors who were traumatized beyond words. The bombings forced the world to confront the human cost of weapons that operated beyond conventional understanding. While the immediate political consequences were profound, the bombings also accelerated Japan's surrender. Emperor Hirohito, after observing both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and considering Soviet aggression in Manchuria, chose to intervene personally. On August 15th, he announced Japan's surrender, framing it as a way to preserve the nation and prevent further loss of life. In doing so, the atomic bomb had achieved its strategic objective, ending World War II, though at an unimaginable human cost. The bombings also reshaped the global perception of science, war, and morality. The United States emerged as a nuclear power, while other nations immediately considered the implications for security and strategy. Scholars debated the ethics of targeting civilians. Scientists reflected on their roles in creating the weapon. Diplomats and leaders recognized that the era of total war had entered a new and more dangerous phase. And so, in the hours, days, and weeks following the bombings, the world began to reckon with what had occurred. Governments charted policies and alliances, newspapers conveyed horror and triumph, and individuals struggled to understand the scale of human suffering. Ordinary people, from survivors to diplomats, were forced to confront realities they could not have imagined only days before. The events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than military history. They became ethical, political, and cultural landmarks of the 20th century. As you think about these reactions, consider the question: how does humanity process events that are almost beyond comprehension? How do nations balance strategy, morality, and survival when faced with power that can erase entire cities in moments? And what lessons, if any, do we truly take from the past when the stakes are unimaginably high? In the months and years following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors faced a world transformed in ways that were both visible and invisible. The cities themselves were flattened, leaving ruins where schools, homes, hospitals, and marketplaces once stood. But for those who lived through the blasts, the hibakusha, as they came to be called, the challenges, went far beyond navigating destroyed streets. They faced burns that would scar their skin permanently, radiation sickness that lingered unseen, and the profound psychological trauma of losing family, friends, and the familiar rhythms of daily life. For many survivors, the immediate aftermath of the bombings was a struggle for basic survival. Food and water were scarce. Wells had been contaminated by debris, Rivers were filled with ash and corpses, and rationing was already part of wartime life. Families who had been torn apart searched desperately for one another, often relying on strangers to guide them through the smouldering streets. Mothers carried children across rubble-strewn paths. Older siblings helped the wounded, and neighbors shared scraps of food when they could. These acts of care were ordinary in nature, yet extraordinary in their persistence amidst chaos. Medical challenges loomed large. Burns, fractures, and wounds inflicted by debris required care that was difficult to provide, with destroyed hospitals and limited supplies. Radiation sickness became a new, mysterious affliction. Survivors often fell ill weeks or months after the bomb, with symptoms ranging from hair loss and nausea to internal bleeding and fatigue. Doctors, themselves often injured or traumatized, struggled to understand the scope and nature of these illnesses. The long-term health effects would follow survivors for the rest of their lives, including an increased risk of cancers and chronic disease. Despite these challenges, human resilience became evident in remarkable ways. In Hiroshima, for example, survivors returned to neighborhoods that had once been familiar, salvaging bricks, timber, and metal from the ruins to rebuild homes. Schools reopened slowly, and children returned to classrooms, carrying both memories of loss and the hope of education. Families formed new support networks, often taking in orphans or neighbors who had survived, creating bonds that helped them endure physical and emotional scars alike. Personal stories from Nagasaki reveal similar patterns of courage and ingenuity. One survivor, a young woman who had been inside the Urakami Cathedral during the blast, later recounted crawling from the ruins with burns across her body, guided only by the cries of fellow survivors. She found refuge in a nearby hillside, where a small group of neighbors began caring for one another. Together, they collected food, fashioned makeshift shelters from debris, and comforted children traumatized by the morning's destruction. Over the following months, she helped rebuild homes and schools, teaching herself new skills to contribute to the community's recovery. The psychological toll on survivors was profound. Many experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, recurring nightmares, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. Seeing family, friends, or neighbors consumed in an instant left deep emotional scars. For some, the struggle to reconcile survival with the loss of loved ones became a defining feature of life. Yet many hibakusha found solace in community, in work, and in small acts of kindness that allowed them to reclaim a sense of agency in a world reshaped by tragedy. Work became a means of survival and restoration. Survivors returned to factories, markets, and offices as soon as structures could be rebuilt. In Hiroshima, artisans and tradespeople salvaged what they could from the ruins, creating new tools, furniture, and clothing. In Nagasaki, dock workers and shipbuilders resumed labor, repairing ships and rebuilding ports critical to the city's recovery. Work provided not only material sustenance but a psychological anchor, helping people regain a sense of purpose in a world that had been shattered. Education played a key role in rebuilding communities. Schools reopened slowly, often in temporary structures made from salvaged materials. Teachers, many of whom were survivors themselves, returned to classrooms despite burns, injuries, or psychological trauma. Children learned amidst ruins, carrying with them the memories of loss and destruction, yet finding solace in routine and the promise of knowledge. Education became both a practical necessity and a symbolic act, a way to assert that life and human culture could continue even after unprecedented catastrophe. Survivors also became witnesses and historians of their own experiences. They documented the effects of radiation, the physical and emotional tolls of the bomb, and the stories of neighbors who had not survived. Many contributed to relief organizations, helping to aid others affected by the bombings, both locally and internationally. Through memoirs, interviews, and public testimony, hibakusha ensured that the world would remember not just the military and political dimensions of the bombings, but the human cost. Communities developed new traditions of remembrance. In Hiroshima, annual ceremonies at the Peace Memorial Park honor the dead and remind survivors of the fragility and resilience of life. Nagasaki established similar memorials, including a park and museum that document the experiences of survivors. These spaces became places of mourning, reflection, and education, allowing successive generations to learn from the past while honoring those who endured unimaginable suffering. Long-term survivors also faced social stigma. Hibakusha were often marked by visible burns or health issues, and sometimes faced discrimination in employment or marriage due to fears of radiation sickness. Despite this, many persevered, marrying, raising families, and contributing to society. Their resilience was remarkable, demonstrating the human capacity to rebuild lives even under prolonged social and health challenges. The stories of survivors highlight a remarkable aspect of human resilience. Ordinary acts of perseverance, care, and reconstruction in the face of extraordinary destruction. They teach that survival is not merely physical, it is emotional, social, and moral. It is found in helping a neighbor, rebuilding a school, teaching a child, or simply continuing to wake each morning in a world forever changed. Even decades later, survivors continued to advocate for peace and education. They shared their experiences with younger generations, warning of the dangers of nuclear weapons and urging humanity to remember the cost of war. Through public speaking, writing, and participation in memorial activities, they ensured that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not confined to textbooks, but lived in the consciousness of those who would follow. If you imagine yourself in the shoes of these survivors walking amidst ruins, tending the injured, salvaging homes from debris, how would you find the strength to rebuild? What acts of care, ingenuity, or perseverance would define your recovery? And what stories, if you lived, would you feel compelled to share so the world would not forget? The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left an immediate, unimaginable toll, but the consequences did not end with the fires or the collapsed buildings. For the survivors, the aftermath extended over decades, inscribing itself into bodies, minds, and families in ways that would last generations. Radiation, invisible and insidious, became an enduring threat, creating illnesses that were difficult to treat and hard to predict. It transformed ordinary lives into a daily negotiation with an unseen danger. Within weeks of the bombings, survivors began to experience symptoms that could not be explained by burns or blunt injuries alone. Hair fell out in clumps, nausea and vomiting struck unpredictably, gums bled, internal organs failed to function normally. These early manifestations of radiation sickness were terrifying because they appeared in those who had escaped the direct blast, making survival unpredictable and cruelly arbitrary. Doctors struggled to understand the mechanism of these illnesses, observing phenomena that had never been seen before in human history. In the months following the attacks, medical researchers began to document patterns. Survivors closer to the hypocenter exhibited higher rates of acute symptoms and fatalities. Those farther away often appeared healthy, only to fall ill weeks or months later. Long-term studies, initiated in the late 1940s, tracked survivors' health across decades. They revealed increased risks of leukemia, thyroid disease, cataracts, and various forms of cancer. Some people who had escaped immediate death found themselves facing slow, relentless illness that claimed loved ones and friends years after the blast. Burns and scars were another persistent consequence. Survivors often bore the physical reminders of the bomb for life. Skin grafts were experimental or unavailable, leaving many with disfiguring burns. Simple tasks, cooking, walking, or carrying objects could be painful or hindered by scar tissue. Children who had survived the blasts grew up with visible differences, sometimes enduring social stigma and discrimination because of their appearance. Yet many adapted, finding ways to live with dignity despite permanent reminders of destruction. Radiation also had profound generational effects. Children born to survivors often faced heightened anxiety, health monitoring, and, in some cases, medical complications. While not all offspring were directly affected, many families lived under the shadow of uncertainty, wondering how exposure might influence future generations. Some parents, aware of their radiation exposure, feared conceiving children at all, while others carried hope that life would continue despite uncertainty. The psychological burden of these concerns was nearly as tangible as the physical toll. The psychological scars of survivors compounded the medical consequences. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and survivor guilt were widespread. Many hibakusha reported recurring nightmares of flames, collapsing buildings, and screams of lost loved ones. The act of simply living in a city reduced to rubble created enduring anxiety. Survivors sometimes isolated themselves, fearful of social interaction or unable to bear the questions and curiosity of others. Even decades later, memories of that morning in August could trigger intense emotional responses. Society, too, responded in ways that affected survivors' lives. Hibakusha often faced discrimination in employment, education, and marriage. Employers and potential spouses feared the health consequences of radiation exposure, creating social and economic barriers for those already struggling to recover. Activism among survivors eventually emerged, both to secure healthcare and compensation, and to raise awareness about the long-term effects of nuclear weapons. These movements were not only practical, they were acts of historical documentation and ethical advocacy. Medical studies revealed patterns that shocked researchers and the world. Survivors experienced higher rates of leukemia in the first decade after exposure. Solid cancers, particularly of the thyroid, lungs, and stomach, appeared over subsequent decades. Cataracts, sterility, and other chronic conditions increased among those directly exposed. These findings contributed to the development of radiation medicine, occupational safety protocols, and public health strategies that would shape global understanding of nuclear hazards for years to come. Children were especially vulnerable. Those who were infants or young at the time of exposure often experienced delayed effects, such as growth delays or immune system vulnerabilities. Families faced the difficult task of monitoring their children's health over time, balancing ordinary life with frequent medical checkups and the emotional weight of uncertainty. Even children who appeared healthy could carry latent effects that emerged decades later, altering their lives in subtle but profound ways. Psychological resilience emerged in parallel with medical struggles. Support networks, family, neighbors, and communities of survivors played a vital role in coping with the aftermath. Religious and cultural rituals, memorials, and survivor organizations provided structure and meaning, helping people reclaim agency in a world irrevocably altered. Survivors became teachers, storytellers, and witnesses, sharing their experiences to ensure that future generations would understand the consequences of nuclear weapons. Hibakusha organizations, formed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, advocated tirelessly for recognition, healthcare, and social acceptance. These groups not only offered practical support, but also cultivated a culture of remembrance and education. Survivors participated in lectures, museum exhibitions, and international conferences, ensuring that their experiences informed both historical understanding and policy discussions about nuclear weapons. In doing so, they transformed personal tragedy into collective memory and moral responsibility. Generational impact extended beyond health and social issues. Families carried stories of loss, survival, and resilience, shaping identity and community. Grandchildren learned of the bombings from parents and aunts or uncles who had endured them firsthand. These stories were not abstract. They were lived, tactile, and deeply embedded in daily life. Survivors' experiences influenced education, culture, and public awareness, ensuring that the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki persisted far beyond the immediate aftermath. By the late 20th century, research into survivors' health provided some of the most detailed longitudinal studies in medical history. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1947, followed tens of thousands of survivors for decades. These studies documented both the biological and social consequences of the bombings, creating a body of knowledge that informed nuclear policy, radiation safety, and global humanitarian considerations. Even with medical advances and social support, the experience of survivors remained a constant undercurrent in their lives. Everyday actions, walking in the sun, choosing food, or bearing children were influenced by past exposure. Survivors became experts in managing their vulnerabilities, often developing practical knowledge about health, nutrition, and care that would benefit others in similar circumstances. The Hibakusha experience reminds us that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield. They are carried in bodies, in families, in communities, and across generations. The physical, psychological, and social effects of the bombings created a continuum of impact that lasted decades, influencing not only those who survived, but also the broader discourse on nuclear weapons, ethics, and human resilience. If you imagine living decades with the hidden, invisible effects of radiation, watching friends succumb to illness, fearing for children, carrying scars both physical and emotional, how would you face each day? How would survival feel when it was not just a moment in time, but a lifelong negotiation with an unseen force? And how would you pass on these lessons to ensure the world remembers what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not merely end World War II. They transformed the global landscape in ways that would be felt for decades, shaping politics, science, culture, and collective consciousness. Nations around the world were forced to confront a reality that no prior war had demanded: the existence of a weapon capable of erasing entire cities in an instant, leaving survivors with physical, psychological, and generational scars. The implications were profound, unsettling, and far-reaching. In the immediate political arena, the bombings reshaped the balance of power. The United States emerged from the war as a superpower, wielding an unprecedented weapon that underscored its military and technological dominance. This new reality altered diplomacy, post-war negotiations, and international strategy. The Soviet Union, observing from the East, accelerated its own nuclear program, leading to the onset of the Cold War. Nations around the globe recognized that the atomic age had begun a period in which national security, survival, and influence would increasingly depend on control of nuclear technology. The scientific community also experienced a profound shift. Physicists, engineers, and military planners reflected on their role in creating weapons capable of unprecedented destruction. The Manhattan Project had achieved a technical marvel, but its human consequences were undeniable. In the years following the bombings, scientists debated the ethics of nuclear research, the responsibilities of those who developed such weapons, and the necessity of global oversight. These debates shaped institutions, protocols, and treaties, ultimately leading to the establishment of organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and frameworks for arms control. Globally, the bombings prompted a rethinking of warfare itself. Strategists realized that conventional tactics, infantry, tanks, and naval engagements were no longer the sole determinants of victory. The atomic bomb introduced a weapon of mass destruction that could decide conflicts instantly. Military doctrines evolved to account for deterrence, escalation, and the balance of fear. Nuclear strategy became central to national defense, influencing budgets, alliances, and global negotiations. The shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shaped policy far beyond the Pacific theater. Cultural reactions were equally significant. Artists, writers, and filmmakers grappled with the implications of atomic warfare. Literature captured the haunting human consequences of nuclear destruction, from novels and memoirs to poetry recounting individual suffering. Photography documented the obliteration of cities and the resilience of survivors, becoming iconic symbols of both human vulnerability and endurance. In Japan, memorials, museums, and public ceremonies preserved the memory of those lost, while globally, films and media examined the moral, ethical, and emotional dimensions of living under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Education became a vehicle for remembrance and reflection. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became sites of study, not only for history and ethics, but also for physics, medicine, and social sciences. Scholars analyzed the bombings from multiple perspectives: military strategy, humanitarian consequences, technological achievement, and ethical responsibility. Schools in Japan incorporated survivor testimonies and historical evidence into curricula, ensuring that new generations could understand both the human cost and the broader context of the bombings. International relations were fundamentally altered. The United Nations, founded shortly after the end of World War II, confronted the need to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Diplomats debated treaties, protocols, and verification mechanisms designed to limit the spread of atomic technology. Yet the spectre of nuclear war persisted, influencing alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and shaping decades of geopolitical tension. The bombings were both a warning and a precedent, a demonstration that technological power could rapidly outpace moral and political frameworks. The legacy also included scientific innovation beyond weaponry. While the bomb itself symbolized destruction, the nuclear age ushered in new energy sources, medical applications, and research opportunities. Nuclear medicine, radiography, and energy production all emerged in part from technologies developed during the Manhattan Project. Yet these innovations were inseparable from the history of devastation that had inspired them, embedding a cautionary tale in scientific progress. Knowledge can create both life-saving technologies and instruments of mass death. Survivor advocacy shaped global awareness. Hibakusha survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki traveled internationally to speak about their experiences, urging nuclear disarmament and humanitarian recognition. Their voices carried moral authority, reminding policymakers, scientists, and ordinary citizens of the tangible consequences of atomic warfare. These personal stories underscored the enduring ethical dimension of nuclear weapons, reinforcing arguments for treaties such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty and global movements dedicated to abolishing nuclear arms. Memorials and museums in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain among the most visited in the world. They serve as tangible reminders of the bombing's human cost while promoting education and reflection. Monuments such as the Peace Memorial Park, the A-Bomb Dome, and the Nagasaki Peace Park document destruction while honoring resilience. They encourage visitors to confront history in a personal, sensory way, bridging gaps between abstract numbers, photographs, and real human suffering. The cultural imprint extended to literature and film. Works such as John Hersey's Hiroshima, released in 1946, brought survivor testimonies to a global audience, providing detailed accounts of individual lives affected by the bombings. Films depicted the horror of nuclear destruction, the struggles of survivors, and the moral dilemmas faced by those who developed and deployed the weapons. Art and storytelling preserved memory, creating a cultural lens through which subsequent generations could engage with the atomic age. Nuclear weapons influenced not only global strategy but also philosophy and ethics. Scholars and theologians debated questions that had never been posed on such a scale. Is it morally permissible to use weapons that indiscriminately kill civilians? What responsibilities do scientists have for the applications of their discoveries? How can nations balance security with humanity? These discussions shaped international law, humanitarian norms, and philosophical discourse for decades. The bombings also affected collective memory and identity. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of both vulnerability and resilience. Survivors, through testimony and activism, helped define narratives of peace, warning, and the ethical limits of warfare. Communities rebuilt from ruins, turning devastation into living lessons. Streets, schools, and workplaces were reconstructed, but the memory of destruction remained interwoven with daily life, reminding inhabitants and visitors alike of the cost of human ambition when paired with unprecedented power. Scientific, political, and cultural legacies intertwined with human resilience. Nuclear technology inspired fear, awe, and innovation. Diplomatic strategies revolved around deterrence and balance of power. Cultural expressions preserved memory, warned against repetition, and honored survival. Education ensured that these lessons were not lost, embedding historical awareness into the consciousness of societies worldwide. In this way, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than historical events. They became lenses through which humanity could consider the interplay of science, morality, and survival. And so, the question emerges: how does humanity carry forward the knowledge that a single bomb can erase a city, alter the course of history, and affect generations yet unborn? Can technology be reconciled with ethics, and power with responsibility? And as the world remembers, what lessons do we take from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to ensure that such destruction is never repeated?